So there is an idea in the cultural zeitgeist of Western society that history only really becomes interesting when we talk about societies and time periods that the West has deemed interesting. I'm talking, say, the Roman Empire or the Crusades or the First and Second World Wars. It seems like interesting, and I'm putting interesting in air quotes here, periods of history must be relatively recent, such as my example with the First and Second World Wars, or it has to be tied somehow to colonialism and cultures that share Western values linked to colonialism, such as how popular understandings of the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island or North America only pertain to things that happened post contact. This view of history is obviously quite problematic, as it glorifies a very limited handful of cultures. But in a weird way, I think that this sort of fixation on certain historical cultures unifies us in a way. Think of the Percy Jackson books, or of all the video games out there set in World War II. These books and video games and movies and whatnot connect us in contemporary times, but it also reveals to us how we, in the West, view things like war and history and mythology. Now, today, we're going to be talking about a whole swath of different cultures across an expansive time period, and we're going to examine how different ways of thinking, philosophy essentially, influences different aspects of life for these cultures. Much like how movies and books influence our ways of thinking today, as well as connect people from all over the globe, seemingly ordinary objects such as a comb or some coins can reveal to us not only how people in the past lived, but how they were connected with other societies outside their immediate locale. In fact, there's actually a term for when people are looking at history via a web of connections. It's called global history. This lens of history focuses on connections between multiple cultures and how the people of the past interacted with one another, as opposed to something like national history, which is conceptually much more rigid. Without further ado, let's get started. To get us started with our analysis of how philosophy can be viewed from a global historical lens, let's first examine this nifty little object, known as the Scythian comb. Now, as the name suggests, this object was created by an Iranian speaking people known by the Greeks as the Scythians, who lived on the Great Eurasian Steppe. From a visual analysis perspective, this object seems to be depicting the death of Siles, a Scythian king who wished to partake in the rites of the Bacchic Dionysus, a Greek tradition. Siles is on his horse in this comb, wearing his Greek armor, while these two fellows on foot are wearing clothes that look more Scythian. Now, something you need to know about Scythian culture is that the Scythians are quite conservative when it comes to their culture, and embracing other cultures was heavily frowned upon. And so, after Siles partakes in the rites, he is killed by his brother for worshipping a Greek god. Think about that for a second. We're not talking about some random Scythian citizen here. We're talking about the king of Scythia, who was killed for adopting Greek practices, which goes to show how serious the Scythians were when it came to their cultural conservatism. The Scythian comb and the story of Siles tells us the interactions between different cultures don't always result in positive outcomes. This might seem like a very obvious statement to make, but how do you then explain the fact that the Scythian comb is a Scythian object and portrays poor Siles over here with his Greek armor? This is clearly not a situation where depictions of Greek culture is totally restricted, as is seen with some other societies in the world. So, what's happening here? How is the cultural conservatism of the Scythians actually being expressed? Well, let's start with what we know. For one, we know that the Scythians and the Greeks obviously interacted with each other. We know this from the story of Siles, and we know this from the fact that the Scythians knew what Greek armor looked like. The Scythians obviously don't like the Greeks, as is recounted by the story of Siles. The reasons are probably way too complicated for the scope of this video, but let's pivot to what this object actually is. It's a comb. You know, the thing you use to brush your hair. This isn't a spoil of war stored in the king's chambers or a public piece of art meant to be hung in the town square to remind the citizens to stay in line. It's a comb. And it's made out of gold. Quite luxurious, quite extra, and quite fancy. Sure, the story that is being told through this comb is a rather violent one, but I don't think the Scythian comb is meant to incite hatred towards the Greeks. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be filled with all consuming rage whenever I'm doing my morning routine. Rather, I think this object is meant to place Scythian culture on a pedestal. I think the cultural conservatism here is being expressed through Scythian luxury and legend as opposed to the supposed depravity of Greek culture. The philosophical understanding here is the fact that Scythian culture will always prevail over non Scythian cultures, even if the king himself adopts the practice of outsiders. Also, the comb is made out of gold, and the battle being depicted looks quite glorious and even romantic. That's something to keep in mind. I think the Scythian comb is the perfect example of how global connections don't always lead to positive outcomes, and how the cultural conservatism of some cultures can lead to a sort of hyper patriotism, resulting in the normalization of stories where people, part of an in group, are justified in harming or even killing people part of an out group. So, to move on to a less somber topic, let's talk about an instance where mutual coexistence between two different cultures does not lead to the death of a king: the Great Mosque of Cordoba. Now, the Great Mosque of Cordoba, built in 785 CE, was originally a Visigothic Christian church, divided and repurposed to be shared by both Christian and Muslims. What's cool about this structure architecturally is the fact that you can see the influences these two religions had on the construction of this building. The Roman and Visigothic columns are combined with Islamic arches to create these super interesting designs, and on the outside you can see more of these geometric shapes associated with Islamic architecture. Also, there were no representations of humans within the Great Mosque of Cordoba due to the Islamic belief that representations of humans in religious spaces were a form of idolatry. Now, the fact that members of both the Christian faith and Muslim faith were able to coexist and practice their respective religions within not just a single town or settlement, but within a single building, is quite interesting on its own, due to the fact that these two religions come from different parts of the world and start at different times. The different visual cultures coming together in this building suggests that there is a sense of unity and harmony between the two religious groups. Now, for those of you who might not know, visual culture simply refers to the phenomenon of symbols and visual images being used to express a certain culture. An example of this is the Christian cross. You show anybody a symbol of a cross today, and they would immediately be reminded of Christianity because that specific piece of visual culture has kind of been rooted in our brains. Going back to the Great Mosque of Cordoba, I think the distinct Muslim and Christian visual culture represented in the actual building is a testament to the fact that different religions don't need to be hostile towards each other to peacefully coexist. I think many of us have this preconceived notion of different religions being quite angry and forceful in their efforts to convert, perhaps. Whether it's through personal experience or looking throughout history, it's easy to think that religions just don't want to coexist. It doesn't help that about 300 years after the Great Mosque was completed, the Crusades happened, but the year is 785 CE, and in a tiny pocket of the world in Cordoba, Spain, there is a mosque where Christians and Muslims put aside their religious differences to worship in the same building. It really goes to show that intolerance and hatred isn't an intrinsic feature of religion, but is rather the byproduct of personal philosophy and what values and morals are instilled within us as human beings. Now, the Great Mosque of Cordoba tells us a story of two religions coming together and coexisting in the same space. So let's keep the train rolling and continue on the theme of religion, because we're going to Egypt next. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the Negative Confession, a chapter contained within the Book of the Dead, a collection of chapters finished in the 6th century BCE, but compiled several texts from multiple centuries of work. The Negative Confession, as well as other chapters in the Book of the Dead, was used in burial ceremonies, and it served as a resurrection spell of sorts. These resurrection spells were important to the Egyptians, as their purpose was to ensure that a deceased individual would have a safe voyage to the afterlife. Now, the contents of the negative confession are quite interesting. First off, there is a character simply named N, and this is basically where a family member or loved one would fill in the name of the deceased individual so the resurrection spell can properly work. And basically, this character, called N, confesses to Osiris, the king of the underworld and god of resurrection, stating that they are pure and never committed sin in their lives. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, things become interesting and a bit amusing when you read into what N actually confesses. There are pretty reasonable confessions, such as N confessing that they have never killed or ordered anybody to kill. N confesses that they have not robbed the poor, which also seems pretty reasonable. But then there are some vague confessions, such as a confession that N has never done any harm or defiled themselves, and has not done what the god abhors or blasphemed a god. Then there are the confessions that seem a little less than reasonable. For example, N confesses that they never made anyone cry, nor caused pain, nor caused anyone to suffer. I don't know about you, but a lot of these confessions seem unusually strict or vague. Some of these confessions can be interpreted many ways, and while I'm sure that there were people living in ancient Egypt who followed these guidelines to the best of their ability, it seems a bit unreasonable to assume that over the course of an entire lifetime, any given person would not cause harm or tears or suffering to anybody else. And the thing is, there weren't any institutions in Egypt at the time to actually make sure that deceased individuals were pure in their lifetimes. Resurrection spells like the negative confession were mass produced and widely available to the public. One could simply buy a scroll, fill in the name of the deceased individual, and all of a sudden, it doesn't seem like the contents of the actual chapter matters anymore in the actual spell. This promise of resurrection in the New Kingdom of Egypt wasn't always the case. In the Old Kingdom, resurrection was reserved for nobility, but it's not hard to imagine that this newer philosophy and religious understanding around resurrection and purity is far more lucrative, an understanding that purity is not necessarily logistically relevant to resurrection rituals, even though the culture still revered it. The commodification of resurrection, in fact, this view of death and resurrection was so convincing that other cultures began to adopt aspects of Egyptian culture. The Nubians, a neighboring power to Egypt in the south, started to adopt Egyptian gods, built their own pyramids, and used hieroglyphs. This all goes to show how unifying a scary concept like death can be. While texts like the negative confession was important in Egyptian faith, over time, the logistics of the spell and the purity of the deceased became less and less valued, and more emphasis was placed on the performance of the ritual instead, suggesting that the Egyptians found comfort in practicing cultural customs even in an era where resurrection spells were mass produced. Let's move along to Hammurabi's Code, a series of laws compiled by Hammurabi, the ruler of ancient Babylon and the person who unified the Babylonian Empire. Hammurabi's Code is interesting because they weren't quite laws in the way we would think of laws in the modern day, but rather a compilation of verdicts Hammurabi made in response to a plethora of different crimes and perceived injustices that occurred within the empire. Hammurabi's law was inscribed on a stone pillar, and the ruler wanted the pillar to last forever. Moreover, he states that no kings that come after him have the authority to change his code. So we're hearing a couple of things here. Hammurabi wanted his code and the pillar it was inscribed on to last forever. Also, future kings just don't have the say to change what he wrote down. To me, this highlights the idea that Hammurabi thinks himself to be above the law. Like, we're not even saying that Babylonian kings were above the law. Hammurabi himself, and only Hammurabi, is above the law because he is able to create them without restrictions, but after his death, well, apologies to all the future kings out there. You're allowed to make your own laws, I suppose, but you can't change what was written down by Hammurabi. Hammurabi even links himself to the god Shamash, the Babylonian god of justice, to legitimize his rule and power. However, Hammurabi wasn't relying solely on his own intuition to make laws. Hammurabi was inspired by aspects of Sumerian, Chaldean, and Assyrian law when compiling his code, proving that the Babylonian Empire was in contact with surrounding cultures and societies in this time period. And let's look at some of the laws that Hammurabi proposes, shall we? I'll do some summarizing. This law here states that if a builder who builds a faulty house that kills an individual, the builder in question will be killed. This law here states that if a son strikes his father, the son's hand will be cut off. This law here states that if a wife were to lay with a man who is not her husband, the wife and the man she laid with would both be thrown in the water. Now, these laws seem quite harsh, almost like there's an eye for an eye policy going on, and this could lead to a society where people are afraid of incompetence, fearful of the tyrannical ruler, but it could also lead to a society where people are encouraged to become experts in their crafts and exemplars in virtue. Ironically, the ancient Babylonian Empire fell during the time of Hammurabi's son, so Hammurabi's vision for an eternal empire was not quite realized. This is perhaps an episode of history that can teach us how a centralization of power can look like in its extreme form. Hammurabi's code places his values and thinking at the forefront of Babylonian law, with little room for any diversity of opinion, and the results of this method are quite clear. Though creating strict laws was good for creating law and order in the short term, the vacuum that Hammurabi leaves after his death is a vacuum that couldn't be filled because he created the Babylonian Empire to need him and him alone. Next up, we have Sky Woman Falling, a creation story of the Haudenosaunee people of Turtle Island. To quickly explain the story, Sky Woman Falling describes the origin of humanity, as well as how Turtle Island came to be. The oral tradition recounts that there was once a woman from a place called Skyworld who fell from a stream of light with a pouch in her hands. As she fell into our world, which at this time didn't have any land, many animals such as geese, loons, otters, and beavers assisted her so she wouldn't be injured in the fall. She stepped onto the back of a great turtle, but needed land to rest upon, so the animals dove to the bottom of the ocean one by one in order to grab a piece of mud. Only Muskrat was successful in this mission, however, and from the piece of mud he gathered, Sky Woman created the land known as Turtle Island, all thanks to the help of the animals who sacrificed their lives. Sky Woman scattered seeds from her pouch, growing into trees, fruits, and medicine. With the sunlight pouring in from Skyworld, the seeds grew, and the animals of the land had plenty to eat. If we analyze Sky Woman Falling as an oral source, it reveals a lot to us about the Haudenosaunee and how they view themselves in relation to the land around them. First of all, in the oral tradition, the animals were on our planet before any traces of humanity, and before the world looked like anything we could recognize today. The animals helped Sky Woman as she was falling, and even gave their lives in order to help her create the very land. Their part in creating Turtle Island suggests that the Haudenosaunee viewed animals as the stewards of the land and should be treated with respect and dignity. But the fact that the animals existed before the existence of land suggests something even more interesting. In a way, the creation of Turtle Island represents the start of the world as we know it now. Before Sky Woman fell, there was no light and no land in the kingdom of the animals, but the animals were always there. The animals are sort of likened to something divine or spiritual, martyrs who sacrificed themselves in order to create the world, in a way. What does that tell us about the Haudenosaunee and global history and philosophical thinking and all these big ideas, you might ask? Well, I think an important lesson can be learned from Sky Woman Falling. The emphasis of the story is placed on the extraordinary gifts of the animals, and it insinuates that humans don't necessarily have the right to claim ownership of everything in the natural world. Rather, humans have a duty to protect and maintain the natural world as a form of gratitude, and included in the natural world are the lives of the animals. The animals helped the original human immensely, and without them, life could have looked very different on Earth. This line of thinking is very different from cultures that emphasize strength above all, or an emphasis on conquering and pillaging. The question of who matters and the question of creation are themes explored in philosophy, both in contemporary times and historically. This idea of interconnectedness and valuing the natural world is what is so intriguing about Sky Woman Falling. Going beyond the Haudenosaunee, a variety of indigenous cultures across Turtle Island believe that the land is sacred and that there is a sacred duty for the guests of the land to uphold. Whether it's respecting the wildlife or making sure no food is wasted, there seems to be a spread of ideas happening in Turtle Island, ideas that put an emphasis on respecting the land. While there are very little written records of these ideas spreading, oral traditions are just as important when recollecting the past. I think it's a pretty big oversight to overlook oral traditions when studying history just because there's no written record. Stories such as Sky Woman Falling are vital in understanding how the Haudenosaunee and the indigenous people of Turtle Island more broadly view the world. Let's talk about a really interesting figure in history, Ibn Battuta. He lived from 1306 to 1369 CE and was an Islamic scholar born in Tangier who specialized in Islamic law. What's most interesting about him, however, was that he traveled a lot. And I mean a lot. He made a pilgrimage to Mecca when he was 21, traveled to places such as India, Syria, Egypt, and China, while also interacting with legal and religious scholars during his trips. He even recorded his travels down in a book, aptly titled The Travels of Ibn Battuta. We're going to be focusing on the last of his travels today, which happened in autumn of 1351. Ibn Battuta was traveling to the kingdom of Mali, and on the way, he stopped by various places such as Fez or the village of Tagaza. What's really interesting is the features of these places he focuses on, and the features which he ignores. Fez and Tagaza are completely uninteresting to him, as he judges the construction of their houses and writes down, paraphrased here, that these places have nothing interesting going on. Now, Ibn Battuta does talk a lot about this city called Iwalatan, even going so far as to call it, quote, the first distinct country of the blacks. It is unclear what makes this city so interesting to him, but there might be some cultural biases going on. The people of the city are, like him, Muslims, and treated him with hospitality and respect. However, there are aspects of the culture he finds strange, such as how men and women are able to befriend each other. It may seem like a very basic concept to us nowadays that men and women can have platonic relationships with one another, but apparently that was a novel concept to Ibn Battuta. It's unclear where this cultural bias comes from, though. One might rule out religion as a source for this bias, as both Ibn Battuta and the people of Uwalatan are Muslims, but perhaps this clash in ideology represents local customs of the same religion butting heads with one another. It's unclear, but in any case, Ibn Battuta seems to be exposed to many new and novel concepts during his trip to Mali. In a way, you could say this is global, as two different cultures are interacting and learning about one another, even though we're talking about people who are following the same religion. Another example of a sort of cultural clash occurs when Ibn Battuta is given a gift from the Sultan of Mali, who treats him to an assortment of food. Ibn Battuta laughs at this gift and writes down basically how stupid and measly this gift was, which is quite mean. But this tells us about the culture of gift giving, both from the perspective of the people of Mali and Ibn Battuta of Tangier. Ibn Battuta expects gifts such as money, while the Sultan believes food to be lavish gifts. It wasn't as if the Sultan of Mali pranked Ibn Battuta by giving him food, but to someone who isn't used to receiving food as gifts, it sure must have felt like it. All this is to say, different cultures have different customs, and please don't be an Ibn Battuta when you are on your travels. Our final two sources are both going to be objects, and we're going to be looking at how these objects visually can inform us about the cultures they belong to. The first of these objects is the Aksumite coin depicting King Joel. While we were talking about Ibn Battuta, we were seeing how different practices within the same religion sort of butted heads with one another. Well, now we're going to be talking about the spread of religion and the adaptation of religion to a new place, specifically Christianity. Real quickly, however, I'd like to talk a little about the history of coinage in the kingdom of Aksum. See, prior to 333 CE, coins that were minted in Aksum had a king's image on one side and either a crescent or a flat surface on the other. After Christianity was made the state religion in 333 CE, however, the Christian cross would appear on the blank side, as we can see on the coin we have here. This specific king depicts King Joel, and was probably minted somewhere between mid 6th century CE when he reigned, and early 7th century CE when the last royal Aksumite coin was minted. On the side of the coin with the king, he is wearing a lengthy robe and a cross on his crown, a pretty standard depiction of a Christian king. This shows that Aksumite culture still placed heavy emphasis on its state religion, Christianity, 200 years after the kingdom was converted. Moreover, the presence of a Christian cross and an Aksumite king on the same coin suggests that perhaps the Aksumites believed their rulers to be somewhat connected to the divine. Even before Christianity became the state religion, it was seen that other gods, such as Mars, were present on some Aksumite coins. Perhaps the culture of depicting a divine figure on these coins wasn't something that Christianity brought over to Aksum, but rather something that was a part of the local culture prior to Christianity, and modified to incorporate Christianity after it became the state religion. One final tidbit about the coin, and it's something that I really don't have a clear answer on, but the other side of the coin seems to be depicting a cross. But the cross seems to be sideways to look more like an X. Now, this might mean something specific to Christians that I'm not aware of, but I couldn't find any crosses that quite looked like this one. If I had to guess, this might be a different design that is specific to the local culture of Exum and perhaps insinuates a sort of blending of visual cultures that transcends religious beliefs, kind of like what we saw with the Great Mosque of Cordoba. If anyone has any information on what exactly this specific type of cross means or where it comes from, I would love to know in the comments below. Finally, we'll be looking at the Cohoba inhaler. The Cohoba inhaler belonged to the Taino people, the earliest hunter-gatherer settlements in the Caribbean islands during the 4th century BCE. And besides being an inhaler, it is also this thing called a simi. Taino simis are these protective spirits of deities or ancestors, and they were typically encapsulated in images made of stone, bone, shell, ceramic, or even cotton. Simis were spiritually important to the Taino, and it is said that they were able to command the artisans that made them, and even wander on their own. This simi we are looking at in particular seems to serve a dual purpose, both as an inhaler for Cohoba, as well as a simi, a protective spirit housed in this image of a person here. The tubes of this inhaler are the legs of this carving, and could be put into both sides of the nostrils so Cohoba could be inhaled, which is a hallucinogenic snuff used by Taino shamans with the purpose of traversing the spiritual realm and seeing into the future. If we look at the material of the Cohoba inhaler, we see some pretty interesting things. First off, it's made out of manatee bone, probably one of the bigger bones like the skull, as it's the only bone that seems to have the right proportions and physical dimensions that would allow for an object of this size to be created. It could potentially be made from the shoulder pad bones of the manatee, or maybe even the spine, but the shoulder pads are quite flat, and if the object were to be made from the spine, it would have some pretty obvious indents, which the Taino simi does not. Thus, I think it's most likely that we are working with a skull here. Furthermore, think of the type of skills and crafts that must be used to create this elaborate object. First of all, it's a pretty interesting shape, and techniques such as chipping and carving were probably used. The holes in the back might have been a product of drilling, and the simi was probably polished too, as it's quite smooth. On the object, there are these porous holes and striations that seem to be a product of natural weathering, but there are also some marks that run a little too deep and straight for me to think that they are natural. These marks were probably created by human hands, and while it's unclear what these smaller marks might mean, my guess is that this is probably the Taino language, or potentially a system of carvings that have spiritual significance to the Taino people, seeing that the Simis were spiritually significant to them. The Cohoba inhaler gives us an insight on the spirituality of the Taino people. The concept that the Simi is the one who commands the artisan instead of the artisan having mastery over the Simi insinuates that the Taino believed that they were meant to serve the metaphysical or spiritual world instead of the other way around. Instead of trying to master or dominate the spirits of the dead, the Taino were instead inclined to ascertain the wishes of the spirits, perhaps as an offering of respect or gratitude. The global aspect of the Cohoba inhaler comes in when you look at some of the techniques employed by the Taino people to create the Cohoba inhaler, as some of the specialized techniques regarding handling certain materials like bone were influenced by Mayan culture, so perhaps there's a network there. Now that we've looked at all of these examples of global connections, hopefully you all have a bit more knowledge on how these developments reveal the different ways in which certain societies lived and thought of themselves and others.